Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kobe Rizik, and I am the membership director on the student board for the Buckley program. I'd like to welcome all of you to our event today. We also warmly welcome Dr. Hayward back to campus for the fifth and final lecture of his visiting series this semester on conservative thought and philosophy. This lecture being titled, Hit Me With Your Best Shot, Top Attacks on Conservatism. Firstly, for those of you who aren't aware, the Buckley program is an organization dedicated to increasing intellectual diversity and free speech on Yale's campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting dinners, dinner seminars, lectures, firing line debates, and conferences. By becoming a Buckley Fellow, you have access to an array of fellow-only events such as private meals with our guests, complimentary attendance at our events such as the annual conference in November, the Ideas Forum in January, and of course the highly anticipated disinvitation dinner held each April, which was actually held last evening at the Pierre Hotel in New York City in honor of Dr. Henry Kissinger. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now on to Dr. Hayward. Stephen Hayward is currently a senior resident scholar at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government. Dr. Hayward has written books on topics such as the environment and President Ronald Reagan, and is a noted expert on the Reagan years in America, having also been featured on the CNN documentary titled The 80s. His writings have been featured in many prominent publications ranging from the National Review to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. At this time, I would like to note that this afternoon is also the final installment of Dr. Hayward's year-long series. He's been with us all year here at Yale. I think I speak on behalf of all of our student fellows when I sincerely thank Dr. Hayward for being with us this year. He has surely become a familiar and welcome face among our students and in the Buckley program as a whole. With that, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Steve Hayward.
Thank you, Kobe. I won't take you out. Well, thank you very much, Kobe, and thank you to Lauren and everybody at the Buckley program for hosting me for this entire year-long series. I can't believe we've come to an end already. There's so many things we never got to, like foreign policy. We never touched on much. We didn't talk about literature, which is one area or one avenue into thinking about conservative perspectives that I think is worthy, and that would have been a good thing to do. Didn't talk enough about God, because you just should at some point. We had to skip over that. And what I thought I'd do for this very last lecture in the series is try to tie as many things together as I can, like Lebowski's rug, if you know that cultural reference. So what I want to do today is take up some of the objections and critiques and attacks on conservatism, and I want to take up some of the more enduring ones. By that I mean, I think it would be a mistake to just talk about the debates on health care, or taxes, or equality I talked about in 2 lectures at some depth. In other words, I don't want to rest on just the current ruts of policy disputes. Instead, I want to try and stand back and look at some more general considerations. In other words, I want to talk, as I usually like to do, about some fundamental things. Now, I think it's possible to make out at least four, more than 4, but 4 broad, long-running categories of attacks or criticisms of conservative dispositions. And I think there's a common theme to several of them, which I'll come back to at the very end. So let's start at the summit with a little bit of comparison, perhaps. If, as I argued on my last visit here, that the weakness of modern progressivism is that it has an internal contradiction between its desire, on the one hand, to have government be more populist, and on the other hand, be more scientific and elite at the same time. And that tension causes a lot of difficulties for progressivism, I think. Well, is there a parallel or analogous contradiction within conservatism that we might be able to discern and work with? I think maybe there might be one. And that contradiction would be between the tension between what you might call the classic Platonic or Aristotelian idea of the perfection of the soul, alongside the anti-utopian practical wisdom that perfection can never be attained. That's, I think, a core conservative thought, is that we're anti-utopian, right? Not only in our individual characters, but also in our political order, right? Conservatives have an idea of the good society, and we uphold ideas of goodness or virtue, but most of the time we are raising objections in the practical sphere, if not fervent political opposition to conscious efforts to achieve the good society, let alone the great society, to take a particular modern example of this debate in action. Conservatives are often suspicious of reform. In other words, we want the good, but we know we can never fully attain it, at least not in this life. Liberals, at least in their most extreme forms, think that the good is not only within easy reach, but requires only that we exercise our will, along with a whole lot of someone else's money. Now, it's not merely that humans are sinful, as the major religious traditions teach, that makes conservatives anti-utopian. I think more fundamentally, and this is worth lingering on for just a moment, human beings are a decidedly unruly species. Utterly unique, I think, among the hierarchy of nature that we can look at, or the diversity of nature, maybe is the better way to say it today. Kant famously wrote that out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. But in fact, you'll find essentially that same insight all the way back with Xenophon in one of his little red treatises, his Education of Cyrus. If you ever read the Education of Cyrus, I recommend reading just the first 3 pages. And it's the first couple of pages, he asks a really simple question that we don't ask anymore. And the question is, why are human beings hard to govern? Especially when you compare humans to, and he mentions them, the animals that we call domesticated. Cows, horses, sheep, dogs, not cats. Nobody rules over cats. They rule over us, right? As the joke goes. But the point is, Xenophon says we never see cows and sheep and horses revolt against their human masters, except, of course, in Orwell's famous novel Animal Farm, where what happens? Once they revolt against the humans, the animals take up all of the bad habits of their former human rulers. Humans, on the other hand, as Xenophon says, we're always in a state of constant rebellion against our rulers. And throughout history, sooner or later, we almost always overthrow or get rid of our rulers and try and substitute something else. The human story is one of remarkable and dramatic social evolution. And I think it's hard to find a non-human species that shows a similar evolution or change in its social orders the way humans have. I mean, I know it's true that elephants are susceptible to rampages that we hear. That may be an actual hormonal reaction. There's still a little mystery, as I understand it. Monkeys, dolphins, wolf packs have a social order that we can make out, but it doesn't change very much. Doesn't seem to be a lot of art to it. I have noticed in this week that we're thinking about grand cathedrals that although beavers build these very intricate dams, they do that by instinct, and there's no architecture involved. No one's ever found an example of a Gothic beaver dam or a Tudor beaver dam, right? They're very functional and intricate things, but they're not done by art the way human beings do. The lion is still called the king of the jungle, as much as the lion was 5,000 years ago. But I don't think, to extend what I'm saying, the analogy I'm using here, I don't think there's anything in the animal world that's the equivalent of an urban riot. That's the ultimate expression of the unruliness of humans, is when we actually riot in the streets and sometimes destroy our own neighborhoods, our own buildings. Now, the lion rules by brute strength and terror, as have many human regimes throughout history, and still too many today. So humans from the earliest moments of history have sought to bring their social order in line with some conception of justice. And that, I think, is a key point. I sometimes make light of this, but it's a serious point, that I don't see a pride of lions sitting around debating, well, should we eat that gazelle today, or divide it up differently, right? I don't see deliberations about justice among animals. And while cultural anthropologists often date the beginning of civilization to the origin of fire, it's an important point, actually, I think that civilization begins with the first human deliberation about what is just. And so if the human story can be oversimplified as the never-ending attempt to approximate more refined and changing ideals of justice through an evolutionary process, then the first and still the best criticism of conservatism is one of the oldest. It's the one that Thomas Paine made in response to Edmund Burke's attack on the French Revolution. That in practice, conservatism is, Paine didn't use these words, but it's often been restated as stand-patism, right? It's the congenital or a priori suspicion of change and innovation. It's the instinctive preference for what might be called the tried and true. and that sometimes this can be an obstacle to salutary or even necessary progress. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But I think that disposition, and I think disposition is a good term to apply to it, is captured by any number of the old light bulb jokes about different kinds of conservatives, which if you don't know, you should. So I'm going to go through them, right? The traditionalist conservative. How many traditionalist conservatives does it take to change a light bulb? The traditionalist says, we don't need to change the light bulb. I like the old light bulb just fine, thank you very much. It'll sit in the dark, right? How bad can it be? The aristocratic conservative or class-conscious conservative says two are needed to change the light bulb. One to mix the martinis and one to call the electrician, but only after reflecting at length about the twilight and merit of the previous bulb. The libertarian says none. The invisible hand of the marketplace will change the light bulb. And the neoconservative has the same answer. It's also none. The light bulb should take personal responsibility for its actions and change itself. So I think you see there's sort of the spectrum of many of the, that's not all of them, but many of the different shadings of conservatism. But I think they also capture that broader disposition of what Paine is after, about being congenitally resistant to change and skeptical of schemes of improvement. Paine, of course, is best known as the author of the revolutionary era pamphlet Common Sense, but I think he's more important for our purposes for having written a longer treatise, The Rights of Man, and then also another treatise, The Age of Reason, both specifically in response to Burke, whom he once met. Before the French Revolution, they had dinner together once in London, so they were personally acquainted and had a correspondence before they, I'm not sure they had a falling out. They were never rude or nasty the way people are today, but they certainly disagreed very sharply and had very pointed arguments with each other in print ever after. And by the way, Paine, late in life, after he lived in France and saw the revolution, come apart, came back to America late in life, somewhat chastened and rather more conservative, and shed some of his earlier radicalism. That's a trajectory not unknown in modern times. People on the left often move to the right, and much more seldom does it happen the other way around. But he is what you might call a gear-drive logician. I mean, the title, The Age of Reason, and The Rights of Man, I think both tell you that he takes his bearings from the natural rights of individual, from the fundamental rights of nature, like Jefferson does in the Declaration of Independence. And that's why he was equally enthusiastic about our Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Or to put it in another way, for Paine, politics was a kind of philosophical geometry with constant improvement, very much like incremental scientific progress. You might say Paine was an early progressive. And for Burke, as I've talked about months and months ago if you were here, politics is much more of an art than a science, and always will be. He thought general rules, while necessary, will never be sufficient for the real world of human beings. Paine, by the way, was a progressive, a modern progressive in another sense. He favored free public education, public pensions for the poor, as he called them. We would call that, I don't know, welfare or universal basic income today. Public benefits for parents, more representation in Parliament, especially for lower income people. And he even called for a progressive income tax, which was a really novel idea in the 1790s. It's important to add, though, that Paine was also hostile to religion, and Christianity in particular. One sample from Paine, quote, "Of all the systems of religion that were ever invented, there is none more derogatory to the Almighty, more unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, and more contradictory to itself than this thing called Christianity," end quote. Of course, a later theologian or someone like G.K. Chesterton would have pointed out that what Paine calls contradiction is what Christians understand as paradox. That's a subject for another day. But Paine could be kind of fun, too. He did once say that if God had consulted the Quakers before creation, all the world's flowers would be gray, which I kind of like. I think that's pretty funny. But I do think that Paine's animus toward Christianity in particular, and religion a bit more generally, is very typical of an awful lot of the left today. I think one of the hallmarks of modern leftism, and actually, I mean, this goes back to Marx, 19th century leftism is not just its explicit atheism, that's fine, but the hostility toward traditional religion. And I think that's in part because it's a rival for political and moral authority. And transformative political power, especially utopian political power, requires an extreme degree of monopolization on the sources of moral authority. That's why religion is always a rival that has to be subordinated by the further out you go on the left spectrum. Now, Paine was hardly the first person nor the last to ground up political philosophy in reason alone or in science, but I think the Burke-Paine dispute is a good template for all the enduring arguments between left and right ever since. Alfred North Whitehead is famous for saying that the history of philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato. I think it can be similarly said that the battle between left and right is a series of footnotes to Burke and Paine. And I recommend for your reading list Yuval Levin's terrific book on this. It's a short book, 200 pages, called The Great Debate. And he goes through this at great length, and it's a terrific book. Now, I think conservatism is vulnerable to a related criticism that arises from this, and that it's sentimental. That means it's captured in the light bulb joke about we like the old one so much, right? There's a sentimentality to conservatism, and that's also captured in one of Paine's remarks about Burke. Paine said of Burke, "He pities the plumage, but forgets the dying bird." One thing I like about this guy, they were elegant writers. They expressed themselves very vividly, unlike a lot of people today all across the spectrum. I think there's a correlative trait in liberalism, and that turns its principles into sentiments, which in turn leads it to abandon reason and its supposed scientific objectivity when complex reality intrudes and confounds the commitments of liberalism. Nothing is more typical of contemporary liberalism than to judge ideas and laws and programs by their intentions rather than their results. The caricature of this I've liked, I think I got this from maybe Jonah Goldberg, is suppose a liberal proposes to help children by throwing typewriters into the Grand Canyon. And the conservative says, that's a dumb idea, that's not going to work. And the liberal says back, why do you hate children? Right? You think the scheme is going to help, and right? And that's sort of the way, that's the style of the argument that happens a lot these days, right? For Paine and a lot of his liberal successors, there's little or no mystery to human life, and there's few things that can't be conquered if we just, and you hear this rhetoric like this, so we just apply our will to the problem, we can solve the problem, as if that's the only thing that matters. Burke was onto this, and I'll move on from these guys in a minute, but Burke wrote that, quote, the savage, a word we don't use anymore, the savage hath within him the seeds of the logician. Burke foresaw, I think, the fanatical revolutionaries of the 20th century long before any of them appeared on the scene. Even remember before the French Revolution starts to get crazy. You remember he wrote his reflections before all the Great Terror and he wrote it very early in that whole process, before things spun out of control. So he had great prescience on all of that. Now the second, and I think closely related attack that's prominent today is, I think you could characterize it as just a more ornery or pointed version of Paine's attack. And it comes, I think, most vividly from Corey Robin, who is a political scientist at Brooklyn College and the author of a book that's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, called The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump. That's the new edition title. And for Robin, conservatism is about nothing more than a self-preservation of existing structures of power and privilege. And conservative philosophy, he reduces it all to just a cloak for self-interested reaction against any change in the social order at any given time. And that's not just a description of its results or effects. Robin thinks that's the core principle of conservatism, and not much more. Let me give you a quote from early in his book. Conservatism is the theoretical voice of animus against the agency of the subordinate classes. It provides the most consistent and profound argument as to why the lower orders should not be allowed to exercise their independent will, why they should not be allowed to govern themselves or the polity. Submission is their first duty, and agency the prerogative of the state, close quote. Now, one defect, I think, of this line of argument, and other formulations of it throughout his book, is that if we're accurate, conservatives would be anti-capitalist and openly anti-democratic. And except for a handful of cranks, mostly found in Europe and not so much here, that describes actually almost no actual conservative thinkers that I can name, certainly not American conservatives. I think there are a lot of things deeply wrong with his account, and I think one aspect of it can be captured by lingering for a moment on a single sentence, which goes as follows. Quote, "One will look in vain throughout the canon of the right for steady assurances of a great chain of being," close quote. Now, he capitalizes great chain of being, and some of you may be passingly familiar with the A.O. Lovejoy book by that title, The Great Chain of Being, written back, I think, in the 50s. A book and theme I've heard many conservatives mention approvingly over the years, which makes it so incredible that Robin could say you can't find anywhere on the right where people talk about the great chain of being. I can name 30 people who do such a thing off the top of my head. In other words, it'd be hard to compress such a large amount of wrongness into so short a sentence if you tried. And by the way, that leaves aside the religious aspects. I mean, if the Bible and the Torah and the other traditional, especially monotheistic religions, don't testify to a great chain of being, I don't know what does. To be fair, Robin mostly treats religious conservatives as a sideshow. And here's the next sentence in that paragraph. Quote, "Conservative statements of organic unity, such as they are, either have an air of quiet and not so quiet desperation about them, or, as in the case of Russell Kirk, lack the texture, the knowing feel of a long-standing witness to power," close quote. Now, I don't actually see an argument there. It sounds more like a mood ring. And so the point is that Robin, and he's not alone in this, his handling of conservative thinkers like Burke and his successors doesn't actually grapple with their ideas in any serious way. There's no exegesis of their ideas and why they're wrong. So, in the same paragraph, for example, where he introduces Burke, he goes on to talk about how defending slavery is an essential purpose of conservatism, forgetting or maybe not knowing that Burke was one of the earliest vocal opponents of slavery before it was cool. So you can find anomalies like that on almost every page of his book. And it's been very popular amongst a jury of sympathetic academics, which really, most of whom don't need much convincing about the evils of conservatives. Let me give you one more specific example from the book that I find interesting, suggestive, for a reason I'm going to come back to at the very end. Very early in the book, he talks about, in one long paragraph, the long history of the legal subjugation of women in Britain and America. And he traces it back, for some reason, to the English jurist Matthew Hale in 1736, who talked about why it should be in the law that women are subordinate to men. So here's Robin. Brief part of this. "If a woman or a man tried to write into the marriage contract a requirement that express consent had to be given in order for sex to proceed, judges were bound by common law to ignore or override it. Implicit consent was a structural feature of the contract that neither party could alter," close quote. I am not sure that his account is completely accurate as to contract law or family law. I'm not an expert on either one, but I want to compare that to a passage from another author. This one's a little longer, but I want to go through it, and then I'll see if you can guess who might have written this one. Quote, "Unlimited rule of the male characterizes family relations where the principle of violence dominates. Male aggressiveness, which is implicit in the very nature of sexual relations, is here carried to the extreme. The man seizes possession of the woman and holds this sexual object in the same sense in which he has other goods of the outer world. Here woman becomes completely a thing." Sounds like objectification, right? "She is stolen and bought. She is given away, sold away, ordered away. In short, she lives like a slave in the house. During life, the man is her judge. When he dies, she is buried in his grave along with his other possessions. The principle of violence recognizes only the male. He alone possesses power. Hence, he alone has rights," close quote. Now, who do you suppose wrote that? Foucault, maybe? Or, Catherine McKinnon? You hear a lot these days about violence inherent in the system, to use the old Monty Python line. Would you believe that paragraph was written by Ludwig von Mises in 1922 in his big fat book about socialism? And in fact, it's a long chapter about the subjugation of women in the law and how it was changing and why it was changing. But a couple of points to be made here. One is that Foucault and his followers come along and they act as though they discovered the subjection of women for the first time. Here's von Mises, 100 years ahead of them. Except nobody's read him, so they don't know this, right? But the broader part of his argument in the book, and by the way, boy, is that book's called Socialism, a sociological analysis. Has that ever come back into fashion? I've dusted it off recently and realized how useful it is at our current moment. But that long chapter talks about how 19th century feminism he's looking at. Why it's changing is because contracts are changing. Why are women allowed to demand a higher contractual status in their marriage contracts? Well, it's because of capitalism. He doesn't quite say it this way, but the conclusion to draw from that chapter is no capitalism, no feminism, which runs exactly the opposite of what the left says today. It's great fun to contemplate this. I suspect if you propose that to Corey Robin or followers like him, it would make their heads explode. Certainly would provoke a vigorous debate. Now, hold on a second here. I outran my supply lines a little bit. There is a residue of Robin's argument, like Paine's argument, that needs to be taken seriously, even if we think his overall treatment of the ideas is defective. And that's how to distinguish between a conservatism that tries to act as a chastening agent for impatient liberalism and a conservatism that is just genuinely reactionary, genuinely in service of interests or preserving an order that, for a variety of reasons, doesn't deserve its status, should be changed, and so forth. And conservatives were indeed slow on a number of things, civil rights in particular. Bill Buckley said that late in life that one of his greatest regrets, actually two greatest regrets, one of them was supporting the Vietnam War, which almost nobody now thinks is a good idea in hindsight. And the other one was opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although his reasons for doing so, if you go back and review them, are not the ones the left usually says. But nonetheless, he opposed it and later came to regret that. And I could go on about this. Robin and others say conservatism is about defending slavery. I think a complete consideration of all that story finds that the defense of slavery owed as much to early progressive thought as it did to any notably conservative thought, and that's a long story that we don't have time to go through today. But that's an important issue to think about, and a lot of ways to think that out. I want to move on to the third general line of attack on a conservative outlook, and it's somewhat indirect. And it's this phenomenon that I imagine those of you who are college students have run across or maybe seen up close and personal. And that's the current fascination of the left with what they call neoliberalism. It's everywhere these days. Now, back in the old days of Marxism, which means like when I was in college, back around the time of the Boer War, I think, the left just attacked capitalism straight up. Capitalism's the problem. And also, democracy's a fraud. Individual rights are a fraud. Today, it's different. This is an indirect attack. It turns out that while the term neoliberal can be traced back to the 19th century and then disappears and comes back again, it's more commonly thought in the narrative, the critical narrative, to have emerged in the 1930s, especially from classical liberal thinkers, as they thought of themselves, like von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. And what they were doing in the 30s, this is the time when socialism is on the march, and also you have the large-scale government interventions of the New Deal here and the Keynesians in England. So you have planned economies, centrally planned economies, and then large-scale government intervention. And Hayek and Mises in that circle were developing very serious, detailed critiques of why that was a suboptimal economic doctrine. Well, it turns out that neoliberalism, the term that's everywhere now, only emerged as a thing, it's a technical term, a thing, about 20 years ago. In fact, I've seen a time series graph, because you can do these massive word searches now, of the use of the term neoliberal in academic writing. And the line is pretty flat near the zero axis at the bottom. It's down around there, right? And then suddenly, you get to I'm going to do this, right? Suddenly you get to 1998, and it's flat like this, and it just explodes. It's a hockey stick. I wasn't going to say that, but you anticipated where that's going. And the way I put it burst on the scene like a new Apple product. And I'm tempted to call the people on the left fascinated with neoliberalism pod people, because they kind of are in a certain way. Anyway, so what do they mean by neoliberalism? Is it just liberalism with classical liberalism? It's just the old liberalism of Adam Smith with neo stuck on the front? Turns out the answer is no. I'll give you one quote from Wendy Brown, a political theorist out my way at Berkeley, who's written a whole book on this. Quote her, "Neoliberalism is not about the state leaving the economy alone." In other words, it's not just Adam Smith revived. There's a lot to this. The treatises are very dense with a lot of jargon. But to the left, neoliberalism is more of a political than an economic doctrine. They say it hollows out democracy, squeezes the public domain, and above all, and here they're half right, they say neoliberalism requires active state intervention on behalf of commercial interests. The reason this happened around 1998, it's apparently about that time that somebody translated a number of lectures that Foucault gave in the late 70s about neoliberalism. He said, oh, these people started talking about this in the 30s. And that's all you needed was the good housekeeping seal of approval from Foucault for it to take off. Foucault is, for the left today, what Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Marcuse and Gramsci were for an earlier generation of people on the left. Let's move on a little bit here, skip over some stuff because I'm going along. One of the things you'll see in all the treatises on neoliberalism is it places heavy weight on the financial crisis of 2008. And that, for an orthodox Marxist or someone inspired by a Marxian analysis of economic cycles, that looks like a classic example of market failure. And of course, what happens after that? You have huge government bailouts of the banks and basic industries like auto industries. And it happens not just here, but throughout Europe, and lots of government financial intervention in Asia too, I'm quite sure. And that part of the narrative is not wrong. I think they do leave out of account the role of the government failure in creating the preconditions for that crisis. I don't have time to go through that whole story now, but people who are interested, there are some very good painstaking counter-narratives that explain why the government bears more of the blame for that crisis than the banks do. Not that the banks were good actors, and I recommend Peter Wallison, who I think you had here recently as a speaker, and also our friend Thomas Sowell has written a whole book about it that are worth seeing. Now, there's several odd things about the Hall of Mirrors of the left's attack on neoliberalism. One is they like the idea that crises, like we had 10 years ago, or shocks, are a feature rather than a bug. I think that's really not true if you read the sort of old Austrian cycle theory of credit balances and so forth, which I think have been vindicated in a lot of ways. But especially Naomi Klein, who's one of the more famous critics on the left of neoliberalism, read a whole book a few years ago called The Shock Doctrine. It's on purpose. It serves the interests of the financial elites to have things go to hell every few years, and it gives them a chance to consolidate more power. And then also, it tends to explain cultural trends. It explains everything these days. I'm sure if I poke around, I can find, within probably 5 minutes, some interpretations that the fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral earlier this week is somehow a totem of neoliberal dominance and violence. The point is neoliberalism has become a conceptual black hole, sucking everything into its vortex. Some liberal thinkers think this too. It's not just conservatives who find this bizarre. Some liberal thinkers like Jonathan Chait at New York Magazine, the historian Daniel Rogers, have said, no, this is a huge mistake and a dead end for the left. And at times, it almost sounds conspiratorial. Sometimes I can't tell if I'm reading a serious treatment or some left-wing parody of Alex Jones. About all the neoliberal elites get together. But if you want to grasp the strangeness of this fetish about neoliberalism, ask just a basic question. As I said, the account is that this all began in the 30s and then consolidated the 50s and 60s, and then the 70s and 80s under Reagan and Thatcher. They're the premier villains, but they also hate Clinton and Blair because they're neoliberals too, see? It's not even just a party difference. The question is, what about the commercial republic of 1787 as designed in our Constitution that protects contract rights and property rights more vigorously than had ever been done before? Wasn't that a neoliberal republic? What about Hamilton's First National Bank of the United States? What about Hamilton's pro-manufacturing policies? What about John Marshall's rendering of the law in his famous decisions in the early 1800s that established us as a commercial republic? In other words, all those decisions can be reduced to one sentence. We really mean it about commerce, and that we're going to be a commercial republic and we want economic activity. That seems to me to fit all of the descriptions of what is called neoliberalism today. So it's not really new. The quarrel is with some older ideas that I'll assert have been very successful in practice. Moreover, what's the proposed remedy? And here's where the critics of neoliberalism become coy and tend to retreat behind some impenetrable jargon. They don't really offer a platform. The way Marx had answers, right? The socialists always had a platform. We want these 5 things: nationalize industry, set up a ministry, right? The critics of neoliberalism, it's sort of all criticism and no remedy. And I always suspect that when people repair behind a specialized jargon, an esoteric language that only a handful of enlightened people can understand, there's some kind of deception going on. By the way, there's an easy remedy for the problems that the critics have correctly identified. Let's abolish the import bank. Let's shrink the government. Let's abolish the Federal Reserve. Let's go back to the gold standard. Let's have a simple, flat tax code that special interests and corporations can't game to their advantage. I have a hunch that if we actually lived in the ideal world of Murray Rothbard or Ron Paul, where there were no bank bailouts, no World Trade Organization, I don't think the critics of neoliberalism would be happy. I think that's not actually the world they want. And it's also a curious thing that the critics of neoliberalism hate the same people that the Bannonite populists hate. They both hate the World Economic Forum, the people who meet in Davos every year, or as a friend of mine calls them, the Davoisie. They all hate them. And arguably the most anti-neoliberal leader on the world stage right now is this guy named Donald Trump, because of his trade policies and the way he rages against some of these things. So it's a curious and confused world. I could say more about that. I can go on all day. I've read too many of these books. But finally, I want to come to the last critique of modern conservatism. It's a variation of John Stuart Mill's famous charge that conservatives are the stupid party. Although in the hands of contemporary social scientists and psychologists, the argument today is that conservatives are actually pathological. They have a psychological disorder, maybe even with genetic roots. I'm not making this up. I'll go through a few of the studies on this. But I do want to say that although the stupid party is usually attributed to Mill, it may have been Lord Palmerston who said it first. But here's what Mill actually said, just for the record. Quote, "I never meant to say that the conservatives are generally stupid. I meant to say that stupid people are generally conservative. I believe that is so obviously and universally admitted a principle that I hardly think any gentleman will deny it." Well, that's pretty spirited. Now, the idea that conservatives suffer from some kind of pathology or personality disorder, which, by the way, no one ever draws the implication from that, but at some point that would imply that they can be treated with what, a pill? Some version of Prozac designed just for conservatives? I don't know, it's never said. But if you say pathology, psychological disorder, what's the next sentence in that sequence? Okay. But this is not a new idea. I mean, you find that the idea, in essence, in Theodore Adorno's Authoritarian Personality, 70 years ago, whenever that book was first published. And I have to say that a lot of the social science findings that are published today make for some amusing reading. But I think are mostly examples of what social scientists warn us about when they warn about confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. So I'll give you a few of my favorite examples here. I'll leave some time. Okay, I'll go quickly here. About 20 years ago, there was a study that purported to prove that suicide rates were higher in the US and England when conservative governments were in power. And I tried to find it the other day, and a long critique I read of it. I can't find it anywhere. It's on an old computer or something. But I remember at the time saying, they ought to look at suicide rates, not to mention death rates under socialist governments as a good comparison. And the confounding data on something like suicide rates in the U.S. and Britain is, it's kind of a nonsense study. More interesting, I think, is that numerous studies and surveys for a long time now show that there's a considerable happiness gap between conservatives and liberals. About twice as many conservatives, about half in surveys, say they are happy. And for liberals, it's usually in the 20s, 23 to 28, something like that. So it's almost a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, why would this be? Some of the explanations are amusing. They run the range from sensible things like higher marriage rates among conservatives. More conservatives are religious, and that correlates with measures of happiness. But every once in a while, you'll find someone who will assert that, well, it's because conservatives are richer. So, right away you run into other data that shows that, yes, if you're well-provisioned, as Aristotle would have put it, you're likely to be happier. But there's lots of social science data that shows that wealth doesn't buy happiness, that really rich people are some of the most unhappy people in the world. So this is probably a gross oversimplification. But not only are conservatives happier than liberals, but you know that social scientists says that we are neater people and smell better too. This is a real study. I'll just give you the description from the week. Quote, a study from the American Journal of Political Science indicates that different political affiliations may actually correspond with different body odors. The researchers, led by Brown University political scientist Rose McDermott, found that conservatives and liberals smell dissimilar. While the difference is small, it is apparently significant enough that we subconsciously prefer the scent of those who vote like we do. I'm not making this up. This is, what would we do without social science? Now, a picky person might say the study, I looked the thing up, the study does not say directly that conservatives smell better, but ask yourself a simple question. Does anyone ever use the phrase smelly conservative? We do hear the phrase smelly hippie. That's an old one, right? And, there's a reason that left-wing gatherings seem to have a high quotient of patchouli oil, if you ask me. There's more parts of this. Another quote from the story. Other differences are more psychological. Conservatives, this is curious, will look at an unpleasant image 15% longer than liberals. And they're also more likely to keep an organized dorm room in college. In fact, one study showed that conservatives are more generally conscientious. Another one that the Washington Examiner reported on. The drunk people are more conservative. Here's the quote from the story. Do you feel more conservative when you are drinking? If so, that's because you are cognitively impaired, according to a new study by psychologist Scott Eidelman of the University of Arkansas. Yeah, we know drinking makes you dumber, and the transitive property here is it makes you conservative too. Although I don't know a lot of examples of frat boys going out to walk precincts for Rick Santorum after a kegger. That's just me, but... And my final example, I go on all day. There's a whole bunch of these. There's a cottage industry of doing these studies in social science. And occasionally they get out in the press, usually not. My favorite one is from a few years ago in the American Journal of Political Science, which had this study that said conservatives ranked high in what it called psychoticism. Psychoticism, which they made great pains to say, we're not saying conservatives are psychotic, but it was very hard with all the thick language to tell what the difference was. So I'm going to skip over this long. I'm running too long already. I'm going to skip over this long paragraph summarizing it, but it said conservatives are high in psychoticism. Liberals, though, are neurotic, they said. And they said this surprised us because neurotic people, how'd they put this? Neurotic people, they said, I have this, sorry, I've got too much here. I'm trying to compress down. But that's actually not where the fun part comes anyway. The fun part comes when they had to run a correction about 6 months later. I'm just going to read you how the correction reads. The authors regret that there's an error in the published version of the relationship between personality traits and political ideologies. The interpretation of the coding of the political attitude items in the descriptive and preliminary analyses portion of the manuscript was exactly reversed. If I was reading too fast, you didn't follow that with me. What that meant was they coded the data backwards, and it's liberals who ranked high in psychoticism and conservatives who were neurotic. I don't know where that leaves us, right? Would you rather be psychotic or neurotic? I don't know. It makes for a Woody Allen movie, I think. It's like the theme of half of Woody Allen's movies, right? And I'm going to have to shrink all this down. It's a very widely cited study until the correction came out, right? Because it proved conservatives are mad. I mean, literally, clinically defective. But this is very popular these days to do these kinds of things. And here I'll draw to a conclusion, and we'll have some discussion. I think what all these attacks, with the partial exception of Tom Paine's, share is a presumption that conservatism is simply wrong, and therefore serious refutation is not necessary. I think this is, as I suggested a moment ago, a classic example of what social scientists call confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. I think the philosophical roots in this are something I talked about in the previous visit, sort of the lazy historicism of the progressive mind and thinking that the side of history or the tide of history is going in one automatic, self-evident direction, and that needs no rational explanation or defense. But I think there's a simpler explanation that doesn't depend on philosophy, and that's the self-isolation of the left. I'll describe it in a minute, but the point is that has very bad effects for everyone, especially the left. What do I mean by self-isolation? Here, and then I will end, I'm going to call as my witness one of the preeminent left liberal thinkers of our time, and it's Cass Sunstein of Harvard Law School. And if you're familiar with Cass Sunstein's work, he spends a lot of time with conservatives. He used to be at the University of Chicago Law School, where he was surrounded by people like Richard Epstein. So he, unlike a lot of people on the left, has read a lot of conservative literature seriously and written at length about the merit in Hayek, for example, rather than just dismissing Hayek as this neoliberal, horrible person. So he wrote a paper a few years ago, it's very interesting, you can look it up, called The Law of Group Polarization. Yeah, typical of Sunstein, he published like 5 different versions of it. He's amazingly prolific. And here's a couple of quotes from this very interesting study. He went well beyond just groupthink. He said, I'm surprised we aren't studying this group polarization more thoroughly. Quote, members of a deliberating group move toward a more extreme point of view in whatever direction is indicated by the members' pre-deliberation strategy. Point is, people who think alike, they get together, they think even more alike and more extreme. Let me quote him a little bit further. Social homogeneity can be quite damaging to good deliberation when people are hearing echoes of their own voices. The consequence may be far more than support and reinforcement. Particular forms of homogeneity can be breeding grounds for unjustified extremism, even fanaticism. If that doesn't describe an awful lot of college campuses today, I don't know what does. One more from him. This leads to social cascades. The serious risk with social cascades is that they lead to widespread errors, factual or otherwise. The social process polluted by, here's his phrase, the dominance of conformity. If there's, again, to restate what I just said, if there's any phrase that describes a lot of the ideological swamps of higher education, dominance of conformity is certainly hard to top. And so I think this is a terrific article. I think Sunstein would agree with the way I'm portraying it here. And so I'll just end very quickly by saying exactly this problem he has highlighted is why the Buckley program is so important here and why I have been thrilled to participate with you all this year. Thank you all very much. We'll have time for a few questions. So I went a bit long. Sorry about that. But I want a big finish, like they say in show business. So we have time for a few.
Yeah, I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions. Is there one to start? Thought I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of on that last note, there's one of sort of my pet peeves is this idea that the conservative is solely the pragmatist, right? Bill Buckley said that conservatism is the politics of reality. But I don't think that any one side, and you may disagree, Dr. Hayward, has a monopoly on good ideals that they're driven by. And I think sometimes a picture is painted of a conservatism that is simply averse to change and that is sort of the gatekeeper and says, well, you can do this, but you shouldn't do that, and this may not work, and really is just reacting to the proposals that are made by the other side, which tends to be more friendly with change. Yeah. How would you address this criticism of conservatism that says that they aren't really driven by an ideology, but simply a pragmatism and, yeah.
Right. Well, so first I have to default to my usual joke about pragmatism, is that the problem with pragmatism is it doesn't work. No, that's a good objection. I think that's a sort of a restatement or slips into what I was saying about Paine's objection and the other acknowledgement I made about conservatives haven't always been right. So a couple of thoughts. One is in reverse order of importance. One is I had this in my notes, but I was trying to cut things out on the fly because I'd still be going. It would be a great exercise, be hard to do, but to do a balance sheet or an inventory of what left and right have been right about over 50 years, 100 years, pick whatever time frame you want, pick a list of issues, and the problem is we would disagree on the facts and we would disagree on the interpretation of it. But, my years in Washington, every once in a while you'd have my years at the American Enterprise Institute and in Washington, the interesting thing about the think tank world in Washington is there really is a real debate, and you really do get left and right. We know how to talk to each other in Washington, unlike college campuses. And so one time there was Rui Teixeira from the Center for American Progress, a really smart guy on the left, very nice guy, by the way. I've had lunch with him. We don't fight. But I asked him one day in front of a public audience, what are conservatives right about, or what have they been right about? And without hesitation, he says, "Oh, you guys are right about the family." You go back to the 70s and 60s and 70s, and you can go through some of the history of that. We thought family structure wasn't that important. He says, "No, you were absolutely right about that, and liberals neglected that. And we're trying to catch up," he said. And I've also asked conservatives, sometimes in a similar format, what is the left right about? So I've asked Yuval Levin and others, Ramesh Ponnuru, names that you may know or read. And, they give answers like, income inequality that is rigid, there is no mobility, is a serious problem. And the left is correct about that. We don't like their answers. That's fine. But so I'd love to do you could go through civil rights and how that should be understood, and feminism. You go through a lot of these things. And as I say, that'd be a hard exercise to do, but that would be a good one to do, and it'd be interesting. Now, the broader question, some of Buckley's writing could be very idealistic and really beautiful and moving. At least I thought so when I was reading him when I was a student and a young adult and so forth. Then you think about Ronald Reagan, right? What was his rhetoric all about? Well, first of all, he used to like to quote Thomas Paine. Reagan used to like to quote Thomas Paine saying, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And boy, did some conservatives really hated that. George Will said that is the most unconservative thought by anyone anywhere, and it drove Russell Kirk out of his mind. And it is kind of, but that was kind of Reagan, and that's why he was so successful. Not just that, but the broader, and what's his other great metaphor he liked to use was the Winthrop sermon of a city on a hill, right? He said that over and over again. At the same time, he's smacking liberalism around for all the pragmatic reasons, right? The closest thing you'll see to eternal life in this world is a government program, right? So what Reagan showed, just on the political level, is sort of a skill. You might even say a martial art of being able to speak in idealistic tones and also be realistic in his politics. What does that speak to? Again, it's the hybrid nature of human beings. We're all of us idealists, right? I just think that's true. It's a part of maybe our spiritual being. I think that's right. But it's, and so really the difference between left and right is, for whatever reason, is conservatives are more cautious. Or, put it the other way around, liberals let their idealism run away with them too much. Sometimes, I don't want to go on too long, it is maybe true, we often have this cliche that we disagree about means but not ends. There's a lot of truth to that, but actually sometimes we disagree about ends too, and we let that go by too quickly and too easily, and we shouldn't. But that's a few stray thoughts on that, because it's a good and complicated and serious question. And maybe by now someone else has thought of one. There's a couple.
Thank you, Dr. Hayward. Really appreciate coming back for the final time this semester. I wanted to ask, so one common criticism of the Buckley program that I've heard on campus and other conservative groups on college campuses is that we're like a circle of victims for conservatives. And like that's, I think, often stated about, you know, Federalist Society or other similar groups of students who come together, whether out of like a shared love of free speech or conservatism or ideas on the right, whatever it is. Is there anything structural about like the kind of conservative student group that you think leads to that criticism? And is it fair? I mean, I personally don't think it's fair, but are there instances in which it is fair?
I think it is fair in some instances, not you guys and not the Buckley program, because this is a serious program, and you know, I sort of mean that literally, as the phrase literally is often figuratively misused, right? No, I do think, I don't want to name too many names, it's going to go on YouTube. Some student groups, I think, do traffic in a little bit of the sort of victim atmosphere. And some student groups like to live by provocation. Like I say, not naming any names. You guys are about something else. So is the Federal Society. What does the Federal Society do? Their dominant model, let's have a debate. Let's have two sides of an issue. Now, so complaining about that is wanting to monopolize something, right? And they're so, but then I'll also say, I don't know, I look back now on how unusual I was, I guess, as a college student and everything else, but this is something Jonah Goldberg likes to say, and I think he's right, is that conservatives are bilingual. Why do I say that? Is if you come to Yale, you go to any university, or if you just read the media, right, you're reading what the liberals think and say, but then if you have a different point of view, you have to work hard to understand a different point of view because it may not be being offered to you. Now, if you're a liberal, you get complacent real fast because you're having all your prejudices and opinions reinforced from day one. So your life is easy. And you don't have to learn how to speak conservative, right? And that's why you'll get somebody like Corey Robin with this really crazy account, or very partial and narrow account. That no, I think that I think that criticism is completely off base. Full stop. Of you guys, certainly, yeah.
Last question.
Thank you, Dr. Hayward. Thank you for coming. Today, I don't know if you heard of what happened in around New Haven. There was a shooting of an unarmed person.
No.
Yeah. Well, that led to a discussion about gun control and whether the Yale police should be armed between me and another student. And apparently some of the things that I was saying, typical conservative gun rights arguments, was too much for my peer, and she just got up and said, I can't handle, I don't want to hear any of these ideas, and she just walked away. So my question is, when they're not even attacking conservatives, rather they're just refusing to listen to us, what do we do then?
I don't know what you can do, because this gets back to the answer I was just giving, is that you're bilingual and they're not. I don't mean to, I don't want to overstate that, but yeah, by the way, a quick story. I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, patience, my usual answers are you have to be long-suffering, you have to be patient, you have to be good-humored. I think that's hard to do, and it's awful when someone gets shot. And it's a quick story, though. The Federal Society at Berkeley Law, 3-4 weeks ago, they want to do an event on guns with a faculty member who's very strongly for gun control, and Bob Barr, who's a member of the board of the NRA. This is right after the shootings at Christchurch in New Zealand. A whole lot of students very upset, demanding the event be canceled, threatened to protest and disruption. And their argument was, it's too soon, it's insensitive to an event halfway around the world. Of course, my answer to a couple of them, I was trying to be patient, was this is the best time to talk about it, when it's on everyone's mind. Of course, who wants to? Well, the Federal Society stood their ground, and the dean, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's very left, but he's a free speech purist. He sent out a message to the entire law school student body and faculty saying, we're committed to free speech, this event is going forward, it better not be disrupted. And privately, he sent messages to me and a couple other faculty people and the Federal Society leadership and said, I'm in my office that day, if there's trouble, come get me and I will come down and make sure your event goes off. Good for him, right? So it's good for him. They had a protest, it was noisy outside the hall. Inside the hall, they did a silent protest. That's fine. Everyone had a sign of someone who died in gun violence, and a bunch of them laid down on the floor. And the debate went forward. Tough questions. That's also fine. That's what we ought to try and get to instead of this. Just this week we've seen 2 more disinvitations, right? Harvey Mansfield from the little great book school in Canada, and then this Polish philosopher in Middlebury yesterday had his lecture canceled because people are upset, right? It's almost like liberals can't take a challenge. And this is sort of, we take all kinds of things, right? It's so there's an asymmetry in the world, and it's I have to restrain myself to not, I mean, I just did a little bit right now, but to not sort of mock them for what looks like a lack of tolerance. I don't know. Anyway, so I wish I had a better answer, but there we are. We carry on. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.